So look, I understand it's very hard to stop thinking about the pandemic. I can't think about anything other than the pandemic. It's changed my life. It's changed how I work. It's changed my family. It's changed everything. This is the 40th time I've tried to record this video because my family are all at home and they keep walking in and out of the room. So obviously the pandemic is like the most important thing going on in our lives. But there's another pandemic and I want to talk to you about it for just a little while. It's an ideological pandemic. And it isn't separate from the coronavirus, although it predates the coronavirus for a long time. It's a comorbidity of the coronavirus, and it's the epistemological pandemic. The epistemological pandemic, its symptoms are a rise in conspiratorial thinking and a sense of impending dread, like everything might collapse. So yeah, it's got a lot to do with the biological pandemic. Now, people have been saying that the reason we have more conspiracy theories in our world is because of big tech. And you can understand why they'd say that. When you read big tech's own sales literature, the things that they say to the advertisers they hope will give them billions of dollars, they say, give us your billions of dollars because we can convince anyone of anything, right? If you give us an ad, we'll figure out how to make people believe it and give you money, right? And so, of course, it's easy to understand why the rise of belief in outlandish things could be blamed on the people who claim that they can make anyone believe anything. But sales literature is not a reliable source of information. We should take every marketing claim made by a big tech company with an enormous grain of salt. We should look at it with suspicion and consider it false until proven true. But there is something that big tech is really good at, something that isn't controversial at all, and that's finding people with hard-to-find traits out in the world. After all, that's what advertisers really need. They don't need mind control rays. They need people finders, right? Pity the poor refrigerator manufacturer. If you're trying to sell a refrigerator, you've got a really big problem because the median person buys one or fewer refrigerators in their whole life. And so historically, refrigerator manufacturers were left with these ridiculous tactics like they would stick a giant billboard up by the airport and they would think, people who fly have money. People who have money can buy refrigerators. We'll put the ad over by the airport. And that was not very effective. It was just more effective than doing nothing. And so they kept doing it until along came big tech, which spies on us all the time. And spying on us all the time means that big tech can show refrigerator ads to people who've been researching refrigerators or kitchen remodeling or refrigerator repair. And so you can go from the very, 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 very low conversion rate of an ad out by the airport to a merely very, very, very low conversion rate of an ad to someone who was idly looking at refrigerator ads. And for refrigerator companies, that's good enough. People finding is a very powerful change in the way that we work in the 21st century. People finding is often benign and beneficial. There are a lot of things we like that are the result of improved people finding. If you until recently held a disfavored view, the kind of view that might get you in trouble if you went around talking about it, like maybe the idea that there's more than two genders, or maybe the idea that people of different races should be allowed to get married, or maybe the idea that cannabis should be legal, or maybe the idea that people of the same gender should be able to get married. You didn't have to just announce yourself to find other people who might believe the same thing and suffer the retaliation that would come with that. You could use the people finding machine on the internet to find other people who thought the same thing as you, and you guys could build an alliance and then you could go public and change the world. That was very benign. But of course, people finding also works for people with non-benign, disfavored ideas, right? If you're a Nazi or a eugenicist, or if you're a stalker or a misogynist or a harasser, the internet will help you find the people to do that stuff with too. And of course, what the internet is also really good for is helping you find people who might believe in your weird conspiracy theories. So what is it that makes people susceptible to believe in conspiracies? I think the one trait that they all have to share is a lack of faith in the institutions that determine what the truth is. And we need those institutions. Those institutions only become more central as we become more high-tech. Because the more high-tech you are, the more intensely technological questions you have to navigate in order to understand whether or not you will die as a result of some course of action, right? Is your airplane's firmware going to freeze up at 30,000 feet and kill you and everyone else on the plane? Can you eat GMO food? Should you wear a face mask? Are your kids getting a decent education? Is the new structural steel alloy that's gone into the ceiling over your head, is it adequate to hold the ceiling up, or is your ceiling going to fall down and kill you? Right? Even if you are smart enough to master some of these subjects and adjudicate the claims about them for yourself, you can't master all of them. And even if you mastered all of them, I can give you 50 more. You will never be able to safely navigate the world without delegating your trust to something else. Now, historically, what we've done in the modern era is not trust individuals to decide what's true and what isn't, because individuals are prone to flights of fancy and boondoggles and errors and overconfidence. Look at all the people who've won Nobel Prizes in one subject who believe really dumb things about another subject. Linus Pauling, the Nobelist, who is a geneticist, also believed that if you ate enough vitamin C, you could cure your cancer. He was wrong about that. He was right about genetics to a certain extent. He thought the helix went the wrong way, but he was wrong about vitamin C. And so we don't just trust individuals. We don't have cults of personality. We have truth-seeking exercises, right? We have these institutions. We staff them with experts. Those experts are neutral. They have to recuse themselves if they have a conflict of interest. They hear evidence from competing experts. They sift through that evidence. They come to a conclusion. Then they publish that conclusion. They show they're working to explain how they got to that conclusion. And then they have a process to appeal their conclusion if new evidence comes to light. And that's not perfect, but it's much better than either trying to figure it all out yourself or trusting someone else to always get it right. It's a process that is legible, even if its conclusions are so technical that you can't understand them. You can understand the process. But that process is for very good reason in disrepute these days, because so many of our truth-seeking exercises have ceased to be impartial and have ceased to be concerned with the truth, and instead have become auctions. Just think about the climate emergency and how the obvious facts about the climate emergency and the scientific consensus about the climate emergency has been sidelined in favor of the parochial views of a small, concentrated fossil fuel industry that cast doubt where no doubt should be cast and insists that the climate isn't changing, and if it is, it's not being changed by human activity, and if it is, it's not so bad. And they're wrong about all three of those things. So as you see the truth-seeking exercises come to conclusions that are not just wrong, because people make mistakes, but wrong for the reason that someone paid for them to be wrong, well, then your trust collapses, right? That's the same trust and collapse that emerged when the austerity was visited upon the Eurozone nations after 2008 and the financial crisis, when we said it was more important to make bondholders whole than it was to have cancer drugs in Greece or to bail out the individuals who held debt as opposed to the giant predatory lenders who held that debt. And, 10 years later, the countries that were subjected to austerity have been weakened by it, have had enormous suffering visited upon them by it. And the people who made the decision to impose that austerity on them continue to say that they made the right decision. And those people are also richer than they've ever been. And so it's very easy to see that that was not a truth-seeking exercise. That was a wealth-seeking exercise. All around us, we see the evidence that if you have enough money, you can buy the truth, right? Whether that's Boeing buying the truth about whether its 737 MAX wouldn't fall out of the sky. They paid a lot of money for that conclusion, and it held up until the plane started falling out of the sky. Or the truth that we should allow companies to continue to merge and merge and merge until there's no competition left in the sector and that nothing wrong will happen. That's obviously something that serves the interest of investors, but it doesn't serve the interest of customers or the public. Or the auction for the truth about the gig economy and the idea that if we turn employees into semi-independent contractors, that somehow everything will be good for everyone. Something that was recently revealed to be catastrophically untrue, but which we knew to be untrue long before the coronavirus visited that pain upon gig economy workers. And big tech, yeah, they're the corruption, they're the poster children for monopoly and corruption, right? They're ground zero for this crisis. They were, after all, the first industry to grow up after the deregulation of anti-monopoly laws, right? Ronald Reagan hit the campaign trail the same year the Apple II Plus went on the market. And when industries get really concentrated, when there's only 4 or 5 people who run an industry, well, it's possible for those industries to conspire, right? They get together, they all fit around a single table, they can come up with a common negotiating position, and then they also have the monopoly rents that they extract that they can spend to lobby. So, people get really upset about the fact that all the tech leaders in America sat down around that boardroom table with Donald Trump after the election in 2017. But they really should be upset about the fact that everyone who runs tech fit around one boardroom table. I mean, that should be far more alarming because, yeah, it's bad when there's a handful of people with the bad judgment to hang out with Donald Trump, but it's even worse when that handful of people are the only people who make salient decisions about technology that affects billions and billions of people. And that concentration is very manifest in tech. Tech is like the most merger happy of a very merger happy moment. That's how we ended up with a web that consists of just like 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4, right? These are companies that grew not through their network effects, not through their first mover advantage, but when you look at them, these are companies that grew by buying their competitors, right? By doing the things that used to be illegal back when we used to enforce anti-monopoly laws, right? They bought their smaller competitors, like Facebook going out and buying Instagram because they knew that young people were leaving Facebook to go to Instagram, so they bought the competition, which is a thing that used to be absolutely illegal under anti-monopoly laws. They also merged with their major competitors, and they created these vertical monopolies. So today you have companies like Google. Google is a company that only ever made 1.5 successful products, right? They made a very good search engine and a pretty good Hotmail clone. All of the other growth that Google has experienced during its whole time on Earth has been driven by mergers and acquisitions, by buying or merging with companies that were notionally its competitors. Or you look at something like Amazon, right, which has established this giant platform and now uses that platform to cheat. They gather data on the things that people who use the platform are selling, and then they enter those people's markets using the sales data that Amazon can see, but that the individual vendors can't. So all of this is by way of saying that maybe the reason people believe in conspiracies is not because they're lazy or foolish, but because there are more conspiracies than ever, right? Conspiracism, after all, is not for the faint of heart, right? To be a conspiracist is not to lazily acquire a belief that other people disbelieve in. It's to energetically master a belief that other people disbelieve in, right? If you go to a vaccine denier, you won't find someone who doesn't know anything. You'll find someone who knows some true things and a bunch of false things and has come to the wrong conclusion. You know, vaccine deniers can tell you chapter and verse about the opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis, of course, is a time in which a very wealthy family had a drug that was going off patent, so they reformulated it. They called it OxyContin. They suborned their regulators. They suborned doctors. They suborned pharmacists. And they conspired to addict the world to their product. And today, that family, the Sackler family, are richer than the Rockefellers, and their company, Purdue Pharma, is being sued all over the world. They're offshoring their profits and disappearing it into offshore tax havens. And the opioid epidemic in America alone has killed 200,000 people, more people than died in Vietnam. And so anti-vaxxers, they know that story. And then they turn around and they say, well, this is why I don't trust anything the FDA says. This is why I don't trust anything that medical science says. Because medical science told me that opioids were safe and they killed everyone I love. So the epistemological crisis is a crisis of faith in institutions. And that was primarily caused by a failure of the institutions themselves. And we see that across the board and especially in tech. You know, as big tech has become more unruly and harder to regulate, we've seen the institutions that nominally regulate them becoming more dysfunctional and less evidence-led. So last year, the European Union adopted the new copyright directive, and Article 17 of that directive, which was passed by a mere 5 votes after 10 MEPs said that they got confused and pressed the wrong button. That Article 17 requires that every company that provides online services create and maintain copyright filters that will inspect everything that we post, our words, our music, our audio, our video, our source code, and our still images, and compare them to a database of allegedly copyrighted works and decide what other people can see and what will be automatically trapped in the filter and not made available. Now, this obviously won't work. Anyone who's ever used YouTube's copyright filters knows that the copyright filters both capture a bunch of things that they shouldn't capture, things that don't infringe copyright, including things that people have deliberately claimed to be their copyrighted works falsely, and also that it catches things that it lets through things that it shouldn't let through, that there's plenty of copyright infringement on YouTube, despite the presence of Content ID. Now, Content ID is this very modest filter. It just filters YouTube videos using a very small set of criteria. But Content ID cost $100 million to develop and maintain over 10 years. So there are only a handful of companies in the world that have that kind of money to build those kinds of filters. They're all giant US firms. And so by signing Article 17, which was then called Article 13, into law, the European Union basically banished its own tech sector, eliminated it in favor of these US big tech giants that have mastered all of this dysfunctional bad behavior and doomed Europeans to only ever use big tech forever, American big tech forever. Meanwhile, the internet that those big tech giants are operating has become far more brittle and easier to censor because all you have to do is point at anything on the internet anywhere, say that is my copyright. You don't have to show any evidence, and it just disappears. So the crisis of the epistemological breakdown and the crisis of coronavirus, they're multiplicative. They don't just add together, they multiply together. The only thing worse than the pandemic is the pandemic at the moment in which public trust in institutions is at its lowest ebb, because that's the moment at which we need to be able to trust our institutions. We need to be able to know whether or not we can trust our institutions when they tell us to wear masks. We need to know whether we can trust our institutions when they tell us that 5G didn't cause the crisis. We need to know whether we can trust our institutions when they tell us to socially distance or stay at home. We need to know whether we can trust them when they tell us that it wasn't created in a lab. And we can't trust our institutions for good reasons. Now, I happen to think that coronavirus was not made in a lab, that social distancing works, that we should wear masks, and that 5G is totally unrelated to any kind of biological virus. That said, I think that all of the things that drove these beliefs and these conspiracies were present long before coronavirus came along, and they're going to be present afterwards unless we do something about it. The worse the coronavirus gets, the less credible the truth-seeking exercises that we have become, because after all, if you could trust the truth-seeking exercises, then things would be getting better. And so as coronavirus gets worse, the epistemological crisis gets worse too. These are crises that fuel one another. So you see this in the prepper movement especially. I have been long fascinated with preppers, the people who believe that you should go and hide in a bunker when things get bad. And I recently published a novella about this called The Mask of the Red Death, which is a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's story about rich people hiding out in a castle during a much earlier plague, during the Black Death or the Red Death. And the thing that always amazed me about the prepper movement was this obvious fallacy, which is that any kind of breakdown in civilization, if it were to come, would be attended by a massive public health crisis, because without sanitation, we will see rampant spread of disease very quickly, right? We have more people generating more poop and more pathogens than we can deal with without a very advanced sanitation system. So I always knew all along that if there was going to be a crisis, that we would need a high-tech society to deal with it, because we would need a high-tech society to deal with the bodies or with the poop or with the spoiled food or what have you. And so I always thought that it was curious that preppers seemed to think that you could hide in a bunker and shoot germs, that we didn't have a shared microbial destiny. We didn't have any kind of shared destiny. Now, obviously, a belief that we don't have a shared destiny, that's a pretty common belief for the last 40 years, right? It's the core of neoliberalism, that if only we are all selfish, the invisible hand will find the best way to allocate our resources. And so it only goes to show that if you don't believe in the shared destiny of people, sort of in terms of what kinds of buildings we have and whether we address poverty or public health, then you also won't believe that our microbes have a shared destiny, that the sickness that festers in someone down the road might someday come and infect you as well. But after the crisis, as the prepper movement took off and took off and took off, I found myself giving more attention to it and really digging into it. And I came across a book by a researcher called Richard Mitchell. He's a sociologist who studies preppers, a social scientist, actually. I think he's an anthropologist more formally. And he wrote a book called Dancing at Armageddon, Survivalism and Chaos in Modern Times, which is a series of ethnographies of preppers. And he comes to the conclusion that the thing that defines a prepper is not a belief in any given crisis, any particular crisis that all preppers agree is coming, but that preppers tend to focus on crises in which they themselves would be significant, right? Preppers like to think if they are good at shooting things, that the crisis will be something where you need to shoot a lot of stuff. Or if you're good at stockpiling food, then the crisis will be a food crisis. In his book, Mitchell talks to a water expert, a chemist, who retired to spend all of his time worrying about a future in which terrorists poison the water supply. And he doesn't have any explanation for why he thinks that's likely. But if there was that crisis, right? If there was a point in which the water supply was poisoned, well, then this water supply expert would suddenly become everyone's hero. And so prepperism is really a fantasy in which society has a place for you, in which the skills that you've learned aren't something useless that can be displaced by automation, or that can be whose wage can be zeroed out through increased pressure on the labor market and a gig economy, but rather something that will become central to the very future of civilization. So this crisis is going to pass, but our vulnerability to pandemics will linger. Long after coronavirus is gone, we will be taking measures to deal with the next pandemic when it arrives. We'll be stockpiling ventilators and N95 masks and building out our medical capacity. But as we deal with the crisis that we were so unprepared for today, let us also address this other crisis, this epistemological crisis, and deal with that too. Right? Let's give people a reason to trust our institutions again. Let's restore evidence-based policy by restoring the conditions under which evidence-based policy emerges. That's a pluralistic world where markets aren't allowed to become dominated by a handful of firms that have so much money from their monopolies and that are so small that they can agree on a single position and pay to have that decision become part of the law. So let's figure out how to do that by putting more focus on mergers and not allowing firms to buy up their nascent competitors or merge with their major competitors. Let's enforce structural separation and not allow firms that run platforms compete with the companies that are on those platforms. And let's mandate interoperability between firms. First, by saying that they have to open up their APIs and share them with third parties so that other companies can come in and free the hostages that they call their customers by giving them a way to interact with the parts of the service they like without having their data harvested by that service or without being corralled in a walled garden that can extract money from them elsewhere in another way. And let's get rid of the filter net. Whether we're fighting terrorism or copyright infringement or any of the other things that filters are supposed to stop but don't stop, let us acknowledge that we can either deputize companies to perform the duties that we used to rely on states to perform, or we can make them so small that we don't have to worry about them taking over from the state. But if we deputize companies to be states and enforce our state-like duties, then we will never make them small enough that we don't have to worry about them taking over our states. Thank you.